Welcome to the Wisdom Window on Strong Island Radio. The Wisdom Window is your portal to timeless knowledge and understanding. Join us each episode as Maddie Cheers and Marianne Franzisi examine ancient and current wisdom traditions and apply these teachings to today's unique challenges. So let's get started and welcome your hosts, Maddie and Marianne.
Hello and welcome to the Wisdom Window. Thank you for joining us. I'm Maddie Cheers and I'm here with my co-host, Marianne Franzisi. Hi, Mare.
Hi, Maddie.
It's very good to be here today with Dr. Cal Kaplan, and he has agreed to join us for the Wisdom of Biblical Psychotherapy. Dr. Kaplan is a professor of clinical psychology and director of the Center for Religion, Spirituality, and Mental Health in the Department of Psychiatry and the Department of Medical Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago College of Medicine, and adjunct professor of psychology and Judaism at Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies. He is also a licensed clinical psychologist in Illinois and Michigan, and a member of the ongoing Faith Communities Task Force of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. He is the author of many books, including Biblical Wisdom for a Changing Society, and also a sequel to, and first, Oedipus in Jerusalem, and a sequel, Oedipus Redeemed, Seeing Through Listening, as well as one of my favorites, The Fruit of Her Hands, A Psychology of Biblical Women. So, on to Cal. We're so happy to have you here with us.
My pleasure.
Nice to see you, Cal. So, Cal, as a psychotherapist myself, I am so interested in understanding how you came to biblical psychotherapy and how you have found that it can work. Many times I see people, and in my heart of hearts, I feel like there is a crisis of faith that is in fact creating stress and anxiety and despair. So I am just very open to hearing about what you mean by biblical psychotherapy.
Well, it's been quite a journey for me, actually, because I was raised in a liberal, agnostic, or intellectual Jewish home where we thought religion meant being a member of the Democratic Party. But I had some uncles who were Hebraists and who had been born in Russia. And I had one uncle in particular, my Uncle Chaim, who was fluent in Hebrew and Greek. He was quite a scholar. And so, you know, I was certainly not anti-Jewish, and I saw myself as sort of in the intellectual Jewish socialist tradition in Chicago. My parents were members of the Dill Pickle Club. My mother had been born in Russia, in the Paleo-Jewish settlement, and was a child of pogroms. My father was American-born, and he was part of Roosevelt's Writers Project. Well, what happened is that my father became really interested in my mother's family, especially her mother, a woman named Krana, who had been a medicine woman in the Stato. And as a matter of fact, her being a medicine woman saved my mother's life because a hooligan who was going to kill them recognized her as the woman who had put salves on his smallpox when he was growing up, and he spared them. So I had this idea that there was something very, very deep in the Jewish tradition that I just wasn't being exposed to. I didn't feel much interest really in, certainly in their reformed temples or even some of the synagogues I would go to on occasion. I was more interested really in philosophy and psychology, and I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, and I really loved the material there to a certain extent, but I loved literature. And I felt that really literature really dealt much more with where people really were than philosophy. That philosophy can describe what people ought to do. And I had one incident I remember vividly that really shaped a lot of my later life. I was taking a course in philosophy at Northwestern, and the philosophy professor was saying that lying is something one shouldn't do. It's morally wrong. But I remembered that my mother's story was that my grandmother had lied to this man who was going to kill them by promising not to turn them into the commissariat, which were the Bolshevik center in Chernobyl. And she broke her pledge to save other people's lives. So here I was, a little pipsqueak in the back of the class. And I said, I don't think it's always wrong to lie. And he said, oh, yes. Can you tell us why, Mr. Kaplan? I told the story. And he didn't know what to say. So I think all these moral oughts and the way of looking at life that has been so philosophical and really scientific in a way, because science in a way is a handmaiden of philosophy, don't really talk about what real people do in real situations. If you want to find that, you need to go to literature.
Yeah.
Or really, what I didn't realize at the time was the Hebrew Bible, which is great literature. It's probably the greatest literature we have in the world, but I didn't appreciate any of it at that time. I have to be honest, I didn't appreciate it. But as I began to develop my work in psychology, I became very interested. I was now a professor in social psychology at Wayne State University in Detroit. And I became more and more interested in cultural anthropology in different cultures. And what I seized upon was the difference between ancient biblical and ancient Greek narratives on almost every issue. And I began to say, wait a second, these are two different ways of looking at life, two different ways of looking at women, two different ways of looking at the father-son relationship, two different ways of looking at the environment, two different ways of looking at everything. So I began to write this stuff, and people told me I was mixing religion and psychology. And being sort of a brat at that time, maybe I still am one, I said, it's okay if I write about Italian versus Puerto Rican cooking habits, but I can't write about biblical versus Greek narratives? Well, you're getting into religion. And I said, that's a bunch of junk. I'm not talking about religion. The Bible is not about religion. And then I began to realize that religion is not even a Jewish word. It's a Latin word. You know, I believe the Hebrew idea is a civilization. It's not just a religion. And it's very opposed to the Greek civilization. And then my next step in this journey was, so why are all the bases for psychology and even the word psychology, why are they all Greek? Why are they all Greek? I mean, psychologos, that's a Greek word, it's study of the mind. And I had an uncle who said to me once, I think the same uncle I mentioned before, that psychology is not about the nefesh. The Hebrew nefesh is an integration of body and soul. It's not, they're separated. And it turns out that's become more and more the prevailing view in psychology and neuropsychology. And
Yes, trauma-informed.
So that's sort of how I got into it.
That's an amazing story. It really is, because your journey, I think, reflects a lot of people's journey with both spirituality or non-spirituality, or getting on a path that can help us recover our body and soul, our mind and soul, our connections within, so that we can recover our connections outside of ourselves. So that journey is a journey that Marianne and I were just talking about, and a journey that I think a lot of people are finding themselves on nowadays. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, I read your article on the identity theft of Judaism and the core of Judaism by the Catholic Church and Islam. And that's very interesting in light of my current study on sacred texts, because one of the things that Professor Hardy talks about in that is how the Catholic Church originally was the one that usurped the Jewish texts and sort of changed the Old Testament so that the Roman Catholic Church could then rule Rome again, so with using those texts to reassert their authority. And then there's other reasons you brought up for what's going on with Islam's usurpation today, but just this whole idea of changing these texts or not recognizing the origin of these texts is keeping us from looking at other ways and other cultures that can answer a lot of our questions today.
Okay, yes. Growing up in a largely Protestant country, America, I realized that my attitudes towards Christianity were not negative or not fearful in the way that my mothers were growing up in Tsarist Russia. I remember she told me a story once that my grandmother, the same herbal woman, whenever she would see an Eastern Orthodox priest, she would spit over her shoulder for good luck. Mm. And I had Christian friends, and I would go to visit people in churches. What the hell is going on here? Why is my experience so different than hers? Well, one difference was that America was a Protestant country, right, and it was not an Eastern Orthodox country. And also, America is a great country, even though people don't realize it now. It's really a great country. Yeah. And so I began to realize that what did the term New Testament mean? What did it mean, New Testament? And I began to really study it, and the New Testament meant that this superseded the Old Testament. Well, what's the Old Testament? The Old Testament was God's covenant with the Jewish people. So what did New Testament mean? Well, it meant that God's covenant with the church. Well, how did the church get to be the source of God's love? Because the church had called itself the New Israel. I said, what do you mean the church called itself the New Israel? What does this mean? And then I studied for a year at Harvard Divinity School, and I began to understand what it meant. That there was both positive and negative ways of looking at it. Paul, who's often considered to be a negative figure for Jews, was far from the worst. He actually believed sort of in a dual covenant, that the church were the wild olive branches grafted onto the tree of Jesse. And this is the view, say, that John Hagee has today and many of the evangelicals. And probably, in retrospect, I would say that Paul was a dual covenant theologian. But other Christians were not dual covenant theologians. They were replacement theologians. And by that, I mean that the church had become Israel, superseding the old Israel. And there were various explanations for it. The Jews had not recognized Jesus as the Messiah. And in the Catholic Church, as late as the first part of the 20th century, said all the nations of the world can set foot in Jerusalem, except the Jews, and they're punished because they didn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Hmm. But back about, at the time of Luther didn't like the Catholic Church hegemony himself. So he had his own revolution on it, and he expected the Jews to follow him. Originally, he was very pro-Jewish. But at a certain point, when Jews did not become Lutheran, he became very anti-Jewish, became terribly anti-Jewish. But so I looked at today, now, what is the relationship between Jewish people and the church? Because I knew many evangelicals were very, very pro-Israel. And they had been Zionists for not just now, but in Britain. As a matter, there was a movement in Britain that wanted to see British as British, son of the covenant, man of the covenant. So the issue for me was how to find a common ground between the Jewish people, my people, and the church. That we shouldn't be in opposition, that our real enemy was Hellenism. We should not have been fighting with each other, because the real enemy of the ancient Hebrew tradition was pre-Christian. It was Greek. The very Greek philosophy and the Greek tragedies that I loved. Why was it that our tradition was so opposed to the Greeks? And that's what I began to really study. And in Islam, it was a more recent idea that they too were replacement theologians in a way, but they claimed to be the old Israel. In a wonderful piece by Bernard Lewis, the great historian, he talks about the leader of the gang that killed Sadat. And he wasn't killed because of his peace treaty with Israel. He was killed because the fundamentalist Muslims thought he was attacking Islam. So the guy who killed him, the leader of the gang who killed him, said, "I don't care what you do with me, for I've just killed Pharaoh." I said, "What? This Egyptian thinks Pharaoh is a bad creature?" And the answer is yes. The Egyptian Muslims saw the Pharaoh of the interaction between Moses and Pharaoh as bad. They all identified with Moshe. So a Muslim sees himself as an old Israelite. So that's their replacement theology. The church saw itself as the new Israel, and the mosque saw itself as the old Israel. So can't we, through all this strange interconnection, find a peace between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? And I've worked on that for a long time. And where I see that the real enemy is the Enlightenment, which you can see makes me so popular in academia.
So, Cal, how does that play into just the psychology, right, of the human being? Because again, this marriage between the biblical and the psychological, how does that come together? And how then do we use this information for healing or moving forward as human beings, trying to come to peace within ourselves, with each other?
Well, so much of psychology really was so cognitive. And so it was like really philosophy. It was devoid of any really emotional underpinnings. Now, Freud saw this, and Freud saw the limitations of the Greek mind. You can see it in The Women of Madness by Euripides, which is about the Maenads. Pentheus has repressed all his emotional life. Yet Freud himself was very wary, even though he was a Jew, and acknowledged he was a Jew. He was very wary about the Hebrew Bible. When he was asked by somebody, look at this man Lev Shestov, the great philosopher who talks about biblical versus Greek narratives. Freud responded to this fellow, I forget what his name was, "I can't tell you how uninterested I am in the biblical stories. My work comes from the ancient Greeks." Well, to the extent that the ancient Greeks were pathological, I understand what Freud said. But the Greeks were so pathological. They were so very, very pathological. Let me see if I have a quote I could read to you by a fellow who did a thing for my book, a wonderfully intelligent guy.
Well, while you're finding that, I thought it was so amazing that the Greek word for womb is hysteria, right? Like, was that right?
Hystera.
And where the Hebrew word for womb is mercy.
It's rechem. Yeah.
Rechem, yeah.
And that how even in Freud's work with women, it was all around women just being hysterical, right? Like this is the pathology of women. So I was like, wow.
You're right. The person who pointed this out many years ago was Milton Himmelfarb in an article and commentary. I want to give the credit for it. It was a brilliant insight. Brilliant insight. And out of the word hystera, comes hysteria, hysterical.
Yes.
And the way they would treat hysterical women was by putting fumigants in their vaginas. I thought it was the disease of the wandering uterus. That's the way they described about it.
Oh my God.
And rechem, which is the Hebrew word for uterus, rachamim, compassion.
Yes. God, this is fundamentally the pathologizing of women.
Exactly.
Exactly.
This makes
so.
me
When
so
people say
upset.
The women Bible is anti-women. It's not. It's not. It's the Greeks that were anti.
Yes.
Yes.
Definitely a lot of the
Anti-women.
goddesses were
They were
quite.
scared of them. They saw them as Medusas, as harpies,
Yes.
Yep.
as Maenads.
Well, wasn't it Sophocles who promoted men having sex with men as a way of having sex with an equal, and that you only had sex with women to reproduce?
I wasn't aware of that, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. The way women are described in Greek literature is terrible. They're a necessary evil.
Yep.
That's all they are. And I think even I think in Medea, I think Hippolytus says no in Phaedra, Hippolytus says it'd been better for women never to have been born and children, for women not to exist and children come into the world by some other way. Well, if you look at the two flood stories, we know that the ice age melted. I mean, those who say this is the first time we've had climate change don't know what they're talking about. The world has been through with many climate changes. And one of the great stories, great narratives across cultures, Mesopotamian, biblical, Greek, was the Great Flood. We know
Native American. They have flood stories.
There was a Great Flood. So, but look at the story of the Great Flood. And look at how the world is repopulated after the Great Flood. In the biblical world, the male and the female of each species, say man and woman particularly, come off the ark, and through sexual union, they repopulate the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way the Greek story reads. The Greek story is the Deucalion, the male, different versions, but this is one version of it. Deucalion, the male, throws stones over his shoulder, they become men. Pyrrha, the woman, throws stones over her shoulder, they become women. This is cloning. This is absolutely,
Wow.
what kind of story is this?
Right.
It's like you have two different races. Men and women are different races.
Wow.
And there's no way of connecting. And we even see some of this in pop books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. The same perpetuation of this idea that men and women can't communicate with each other. Well, I don't think that was the biblical view at all. I think men and women did communicate with each other, and they grew from each other. They needed each other, and they fused together in a larger connection. But that was absent in the Greek world. Absolutely absent.
So do you use biblical stories in your psychotherapeutic practice? Like, do you bring a story in to set a example, or how do you work with it?
Well, in our latest book, my colleague Paul Kantz and I've also worked with Matthew Schwartz, we talk about applying it to suicide prevention.
Wow.
And we look at risk factors empirically based for suicide in today's world. And let me see if I can find these risk factors.
And suicide is a big
feeling,
problem.
feeling isolated and ignored.
Yes.
But there's a great comparison between the story of Ajax and the story of Elijah. Each of them winds up very, very depressed. For those who might not know the story, Elijah has been really chased mercilessly by Jezebel. And finally he comes to a clearing. He says, I can't go on. I want to die. I'm exhausted. And Ajax is made mad by Athena, and he expresses he wants to die. But if you look at how these two narratives go on, Ajax is left alone. His brother says, don't leave my brother alone. They leave him alone. And he goes out and he falls on a sword. In the biblical story of Elijah, an angel comes, a great Gustave Doré painting, an angel comes and gives him food and drink and company. And on the basis of that, and gives him a chance to rest. And the basis of that, the biblical story is clear. Elijah recovers his strength and goes on to Horeb. That's a simple act.
Yes.
And we've tried this. We actually had two patients, male and a female, that we analyzed our cases with this. And another example would be, say, you want me to go through many examples of this? Or?
Sure. You can give us another example. That'd be great.
I do think it's a very important
Okay.
topic because
That's
it's a
one that most people don't
big
realize.
problem.
I'll give you two more. One, Job and Zeno. Zeno is the founder of Stoicism. And Stoicism is always considered to be a great philosophy. I'm not so sure it is at all.
Really?
But what happens is Zeno is a man about 70. He's the founder of Stoicism, Zeno the Stoic. He leaves the Stoa, the porch where he's giving a lecture, and he stubs his toe. Maybe he wrenches his toe. And he interprets this as a sign from the gods he should depart, and he holds his breath until he dies. Now, what the heck is going on?
Really?
I stubbed my toe. Last week I hit my knee.
It hurts a lot.
Maybe it's time for me to hold my breath and die. First, you can't hold your breath till you die.
Right.
Because you'll start breathing again.
It's so childlike.
Compare this to Job, who has every imaginable assault on him. He loses his family, he loses his health, he loses his money. His wife is telling him, curse God and die. His friend said, you're guilty. He doesn't. He complains to God.
Yeah.
Why are you doing this to me? But he never breaks his faith with God. And on that faith, he is restored. He recovers his strength and all is restored to him. So how was it Zeno killed himself after a minor assault? And Job doesn't. After a huge, what is the lesson we can learn from that?
Well, it's interesting with that because Job actually has a relationship with God.
Right.
Versus I'm just trying to read the signs that God is sending me. Like he is complaining and arguing and upset with God all along the way. So there is relationship.
What you're saying is so good. I think it's so much to the point. Because Zeno does not have a relationship with God, he catastrophizes.
Yes.
People without relationships with God search for meaning in the most destructive ways.
Oh, true.
They do all kinds of crazy things. Their motive is because they feel lost. So for Zeno, he actually had a positive gain by thinking that it was Zeus who caused him to fall and stub and wrench his toe. Yeah. This was superior to him than not having a relationship. And we call this catastrophizing.
Wow.
People catastrophize all the time because it gives their life meaning, because they don't have an underlying purpose, which enables them to not catastrophize. Okay, I stubbed my toe. Now I got to go on and take care of my family, and I got to take care of a mayor of the city, and I'm going to go ahead and, okay, I'll put a little bandage on my toe. But that's not what Zeno does.
That is, I think, a beautiful place to maybe bring part one of our talk to a close today.
Yeah.
And continue it in part two of this, really looking at what you're getting at, Cal, is the underlying purpose of life and how we do make meaning. And catastrophizing is a way to make meaning.
It is, but a negative
Right?
way.
Negative, right?
Negative versus the positive. What are the stories that point us towards the more positive, healing ways of navigating being human, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. So thank you for being here for part one of your talk, Cal. And if you would really quickly give everybody a way to get in contact with you or find your books and your work, that would be great.
You can contact me at my email, calkap@aol.com, KALKAP @AOL.com. I use that more than my university email these days. And you can look at my website, kalmankaplan.com, KALMAN Kaplan.com. I think it also may be called biblicalpsychology.org, but I don't remember that. But look at kalmankaplan.com. Not only do I have listed many of my books, we have actually recorded video readings of the first two plays that I've written in the Oedipus cycle that you've mentioned, Oedipus in Jerusalem and Oedipus Redeemed. Then the COVID hit, and we still have to do the third one, Oedipus the Teacher, Return to Thebes, where he goes back and he Hebraicizes the Greeks.
Oh, I'm curious
Wonderful.
about all of that. So
Really?
I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
So thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, as always, Bobby Lacera, our wonderful producer. And we will be back with part two next week. Everybody have a great week. Thank you so much.